Hi everyone, welcome back to my shop. In this video, I'm going to make an entryway or a sofa table. They're both about 30 inches tall, and I'm going to make it about 4 feet long. I want to try some new things. One would be breadboard ends, and I'd also like to run a texturing program on the CNC on those ends. I've got the pieces for my tabletop right here. It's only going to be 3. I've run them through the jointer and the planer, just to do the top and the bottom. So what I'm going to do now, getting ready to glue them up, is I'm going to put them together, throw some clamps on them, and then run them through the jointer together. So that way the edges, even if the jointer is not perfectly square, these will glue up very nicely. I'm not using any biscuits or dominoes to hold it together. The wood is nearly an inch thick, and the glue should be plenty strong enough. But I do have the Type Bond 2 Dark for Walnut. Now the tabletop is just under an inch thick, and I was thinking that the tenons would be about ½ inch, but that wouldn't leave very much. So I think on my mortiser I do have a 3/8 inch bit, so I think I'm going to shoot for 3/8. The next step is to cut the mortise into the ends, so I'm going to lay that out. I'm going to be about ½ inch in from the ends, ½ inch deep along the most of the length, and then for the longer part of the tenons, I will lay that out separately. I'm over here at my dado stack, and I want to cut down the piece for the tenons. This is the scrap piece I cut off earlier, and I've got the breadboard end. I've measured this with my caliper, and in this instance, it's a lot easier if you just switch over to the metric system. So I'm at millimeters. This is 9.5 millimeters. I want to cut my tenons down to 11 millimeters, and I will finish it off with a router plane so that I get a nice snug fit. I feel I'm pretty close to where I need to be, and I'm going to start transferring the marks from the deeper parts of the mortises over onto the tenons so I can cut them. This will be my shoulder that runs right across the whole tenon. Not yet. We're getting a bit closer. Ooh, I think there we go. That took quite a while to do. I think on the next side, I'm going to spend a bit more time making sure that the whole tenon is a bit closer to the proper dimension before I cut it and start fitting it. Yay! I've got both ends fitting very nicely. I'm still going to pin them in place with a dowel using the drawboard technique, which basically uses offset holes to kind of clamp the ends on. So I'm going to do that, but first I do want to fill up these knot holes with epoxy, and while the epoxy is drying, I'm going to get started on the lens. I'm using the Total Boat tabletop epoxy. It's good for cracks up to 1/8 of an inch, and it has a faster drying time than any of the deep pour epoxies. So while the epoxy is drying in those little holes, I'm keeping an eye on it. I've been playing with the taper of the leg and how far I want it to lean in, and I just did it here on my bench top with some tape. I started out with 5 degrees leaning and a 5-degree taper on the leg, which wasn't nearly enough, and I just kept going more and more, and ended up with about 20 degrees, and this is what I ended up with. Let me stop you right there. I'm going to rethink the legs. I've been popping in and out of the shop the last couple of days. But as I come into the shop and I see my template, I dislike it more and more every time I see it. It's just that it's too chunky for the thickness of the top. The top's just slightly less than 1 inch. And I think as thick as these legs are, it's just going to take away from it. So as I rethink my poor choices, let's go back to the tabletop, because I'm about 60% sure about what I'm going to do with that. I'm going to start laying out where I want my dowels to go through. My tenon is 2.5 inches wide, so I'm going to go for 1.25 inches. And they are 2 inches long, so if I put them in about 1 inch, I think it's more of an aesthetic thing than anything else. I'll go with 1.25 inches. I just cleaned up where the drill bit came through in the mortises with the chisel, and then once again put the breadboard ends on the workpiece. And since I'm using a 3/8 inch dowel, I use the next smallest drill bit in my index to go through the holes I just drilled and mark the tenons on the side of the workpiece. And that way when I'm putting the dowel in, it'll have a bit of an offset and it'll act like a clamp and hopefully keep my breadboard ends nice and tight. The breadboard ends are ready to put on, but before I do that, I still have a lot of machine marks from the joiner and the planer. Some of the glue joints are still visible, and I'd like to take a crack at it with my hand planes. But there is a bit of grain switching back and forth, so I'm not sure how far I'll get before I chicken out, take it outside, and sand it. And that is going against the grain. Ugh. That actually worked pretty good, but not good enough that I'm going to take my smoothing plane and try to go without sandpaper. So maybe another time on something that's got a bit more kinder grain and not switching back and forth. The scraper plane worked really well for knocking down the glue joints and getting rid of those few bits of extra epoxy. I've got my dowels cut and I put a nice little taper on them on the disc sander. On the last project I did, the dowels didn't fit so well and it's a bit of a panic when you've got something glued up and you start knocking dowels in that don't fit. So I've got them chucked up one at a time. I've got a little gauge here of the 3/8 hole. So I'm just going to run them through some sandpaper. While the ends were still quite manageable, I drew a radius on it. I used a bandsaw to cut them out and my disc sander to smooth them out. I could have used the table router, but I was afraid that the bit would take a chunk out of the corner since it's kind of end grain. So this was the safest option. I know I said I was going to have the CNC do this finish, but I thought I'd take a whack at it myself. So I bought a 3/8 inch gouging chisel off of eBay. I put a real shallow grind on it, and I practiced on some cherry. And I was trying to use it to put the finish on that I had in my mind, and it didn't work very well because this chisel is just not capable of it. I would have needed a wider one, maybe 1/2 inch or even 3/4. Once I started putting on the finish that this chisel was capable of, it got a lot easier and looked a lot better. In the end, I quite like it. It's really inconsistent and random, but that's how it's supposed to look. So I'm very happy with it. For woods like walnut and cherry, I don't think you can beat Rubio Monocoat. It's a perfect one-and-done type finish. Although on the tabletop itself, I will add maintenance oil after about 2 days, and that will add just a little bit more shine and a little bit more depth to it. With the top complete, it's time to get back to the legs. This is the first version. I didn't like them. I felt that this part here was too fat. And here's version 2. It's going to stand upright. It's much narrower. I think once all these corners are rounded over, it'll virtually disappear. And luckily, I will still be able to use all the walnut that I milled up for version 1. I spent a bit of time last night working on the apron. I'm going to use dominoes to connect the apron to the legs, but the pieces that go from the front to the back and are going to carry the tabletop itself, I'm going to use mortise and tenon, and I want it to poke out through the front a little bit, and I'm going to use like a cherry wedge to go in there just to carry the cherry on throughout the project. Now my mortise and tenon technique could use a bit of work, but what I did is I used a little bit of glue and I put it in the gaps, and then I got some sandpaper and sanded around it, and that dust mixed with the glue. It doesn't fix it, but it does make it look a bit better. Well, it's all done, and I think it looks great. I did this as a bit of a learning experience so that I can try some new things. So let's cover the things I liked about it and the things I don't like so much about it and would change if I was to do it again. First off, it's hard to go wrong when you're starting off with walnut and cherry. Both those woods look really good, and they really complement each other. I really like the breadboard ends. I think that came out really well, and I like the contrasting walnut dowels. The texturing, I think it looks really good. You hardly even see it when you're looking at it from above, but when the light hits it right, it really stands out. I like the cherry wedges and the tenons. It just kind of ties the cherry through the piece. I also like the taper on the bottom of the table, but this is also one of the things I might change. This taper is about 1.5 inches. I think I would have cut deeper so that the profile is thinner, and I would extend it out instead of being 1.5 inches to maybe like 3 inches. But I was limited on this because of the breadboard ends, and I didn't want to cut into the tenons. One of the things I should have done about the top is that 2 of the pieces are book matched, the third piece is not, and it's obvious. So what I should have done is maybe cut that third piece in half and put it on the other side of the book matched pieces, just so that it's framed. But thank you for watching. Hit the old like button, and better yet, subscribe. Thanks for watching, everyone.